An airplane lifts off from Frankfurt at 6 in the morning. The cabin is dark. The engines roar. The wings cut through the cold air with the same precision they would use on any other day. But inside that aircraft, there are no passengers. Not a single one. The seats are empty. The overhead bins are closed. The flight attendants are not on board because there is no one to serve. This plane is flying across Europe with nobody inside it. And yet, somewhere in a glass office building, an executive is reviewing the quarterly numbers and smiling. Because that empty flight just made the airline money. This is not a glitch. This is not a mistake. This is the airline industry working exactly as designed. For years, travelers have assumed the math is simple. More passengers means more revenue. Empty seats mean losses. A full plane is a winning plane and a half-empty plane is a failing one. That picture is comforting. It is also wrong. Inside the modern airline business, the relationship between bodies in seats and dollars in the bank has been quietly rewired. Today, an aircraft can fly with 20% of its capacity, 10%, sometimes 0%, and still contribute to a profitable balance sheet. The reason is hidden in plain sight, written into government contracts, leasing agreements, fuel hedging strategies, credit card partnerships, and decades of cleverly engineered financial architecture. Most travelers will never see any of it. They believe their ticket is what keeps the airline alive. In reality, the ticket is just the surface. Underneath it sits an entire economy that does not depend on whether the seat next to you is filled. This is the story of how airlines learn to make money even when the planes are empty. How an industry famous for losses, bankruptcies, and razor-thin margins built a parallel revenue system most passengers cannot even see. By the end of this video, you will look at every flight differently. You will understand why your boarding pass is not the product. The empty seats around you are not a problem the airline is trying to solve. They are part of a much larger machine, one that profits from the sky in ways the public was never meant to fully understand. For most of aviation history, airlines genuinely did rely on full cabins. Through the 1960s and 70s, the industry was tightly regulated. Routes were assigned, fares were fixed, and competition was limited. Carriers competed on prestige rather than price, and the rule was simple: sell tickets, fill seats, cover costs, repeat. Then in the late 70s, deregulation arrived. The protective walls came down. New carriers entered the market. Prices collapsed. Suddenly, 10 airlines were chasing the same passenger between the same two cities, and the fare wars began. Profit margins evaporated almost overnight. Across 2 decades, dozens of legacy airlines collapsed, merged, or filed for bankruptcy. Pan Am, TWA, Eastern, Braniff, names that once defined the golden age of flight simply vanished from the map. The industry learned a brutal lesson during those decades. Selling tickets alone was not a business. It was a slow form of suicide. Jet fuel was volatile. Labor costs were rising. Aircraft cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And the passenger, the supposed king of the cabin, was unbelievably price-sensitive. Lower the fare by $10 and a competitor would lower it by $20. Try to raise prices and travelers would simply disappear to another airline. The survivors of that era did not just become better at flying. They became better at finance. They began to study their own operations the way Wall Street studies a portfolio. They asked a question almost no airline had asked before. If the passenger is unprofitable, what else can we sell that is not a passenger? The answers reshaped the entire industry. Cargo space in the belly of the aircraft became a revenue stream worth billions. Frequent flyer miles became a currency. Government mail contracts became guaranteed income. Airport gate slots became financial assets that could be traded and counted on a balance sheet. By the early 2000s, the smartest airlines were no longer in the business of moving people. They were in the business of moving anything that paid and selling everything that could be sold around the act of flying. The myth of the full plane survived in the public imagination because it made intuitive sense. But inside the boardrooms, That myth had already been replaced by something colder. The plane was no longer the product. The plane was the platform. Look at any commercial airliner from the outside, and you see two things: the fuselage where the passengers sit, and the wings. What you do not see is the volume hidden underneath the cabin floor. That space is called the belly hold. And for a major carrier, it is one of the most profitable square meters in the entire aircraft. When passengers think about cargo, they think about their own suitcase. The belly hold actually carries far more than luggage. It carries fresh flowers from Kenya, destined for European supermarkets. It carries pharmaceuticals from Switzerland that must arrive within hours. It carries semiconductor chips from Taiwan, fashion samples from Italy, automotive parts from Germany, vaccines from India. The belly of a passenger plane is, in many cases, an international cargo network operating on top of a passenger network. The economics of this are extraordinary. A typical wide-body aircraft, the kind that crosses oceans, can carry between 20 and 30 tons of cargo on top of passenger luggage. On certain routes, the cargo revenue alone can rival or exceed the revenue from every economy class ticket sold on the same flight. Pharmaceutical companies will pay premium rates for guaranteed temperature-controlled space. E-commerce giants will sign multi-year contracts to lock in capacity. The plane has to fly anyway, so every kilogram of cargo loaded into that belly is essentially pure margin once the basic operating costs are covered. This is why an airline can fly a half-empty cabin across the Atlantic and still post a healthy profit on that route. The passengers are not the only customers. They are simply the most visible. Sitting in the dark hold beneath them, 20 tons of high-value freight is paying its own way, often at higher per kilogram rates than the human beings sitting upstairs. During the disruption of the early 2020s, when passenger demand briefly disappeared, this became visible to the entire world. Airlines began flying so-called Praetor flights, passenger aircraft with no passengers, used purely to transport cargo. The seats were empty, the cabin was dark. And those flights were among the most profitable operations the industry had ever seen. The cargo hold is the engine. In 1981, an airline launched what looked like a small marketing program. Frequent travelers would earn points for each flight, and those points could be redeemed for free trips. It seemed like a simple loyalty gesture. Within a decade, that program would mutate into one of the most lucrative financial products ever invented. Today, the loyalty program of a major airline is often worth more than the airline itself. Read that again. The points program is more valuable than the airplanes, the routes, the brand, and every employee combined. During the financial stress of the early 2020s, when carriers needed emergency liquidity, several major airlines pledged their loyalty programs as collateral for multi-billion-dollar loans. Investment banks valued these programs at $20, $30, in some cases over $50 billion. The flying business was secondary collateral. The points business was the prize. How did this happen? The mechanism is elegant and almost invisible. And an airline does not just give you miles when you fly. It sells those miles in enormous quantities to credit card companies. When you swipe a co-branded airline credit card at a grocery store, the bank pays the airline for the miles you just earned. Multiply that by tens of millions of cardholders, billions of transactions per year, and you have a continuous river of cash flowing from the banking sector into the airline. With no aircraft moving an inch, the airline books that money up front. The miles you earned sit on the balance sheet as a liability, but a soft one, because a meaningful percentage of miles are never redeemed. They expire. They sit unused. Every unredeemed mile is a tiny gift back to the airline. And when you do redeem, the airline controls the conversion rate. They decide how many points equal a flight. They can quietly devalue the currency at any time, and they regularly do. A loyalty program is essentially a private currency printed by the airline, sold to financial institutions for real dollars, and slowly clawed back through controlled inflation and expiration. The plane in the sky has become almost ceremonial. The real product is the points economy operating around it, generating cash whether you ever step on board or not. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Each video on Titan Codex pulls back the curtain on the financial machinery that quietly runs the modern world. The systems most people will never see. If you want more stories like this one, ones that change the way you understand business, money, and power, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. It is the simplest way to support the work, and it makes sure the next investigation reaches you when it drops. Now, back to the story. There is a kind of flight that almost no traveler has heard of, but every taxpayer pays for. In remote regions across multiple continents, certain routes are flown not because they are profitable, but because the government has decided that a community must remain connected to the wider world. These are subsidized routes. The airline operates the flight, the seats may sit largely empty, and the government writes a check to make up the difference. In some cases, the subsidy covers the entire operating cost plus a guaranteed margin. The airline is, in effect, paid to fly. In the United States, this program is called Essential Air Service. In Europe, similar arrangements exist under public service obligations. In Australia, in Canada, in parts of South America, governments contract with carriers to maintain service to small towns, mining communities, and isolated islands. The economic logic from the carrier's perspective is simple. The route is guaranteed. The risk is removed. The plane could fly with 3 passengers, and the airline still gets paid. Beyond direct subsidies, governments support airlines through a deeper layer of financial scaffolding. Mail contracts have been a quiet pillar of airline finance since the 1920s. National postal services pay carriers to move letters and packages on regular routes, providing steady cash flow that does not depend on holiday seasons or vacation demand. Diplomatic cargo, military logistics, humanitarian shipments, all of it flows through commercial passenger and cargo aircraft, often under multi-year contracts negotiated quietly between airlines and government agencies. Then there is the hidden financial protection. Major airlines benefit from bilateral air service agreements that limit foreign competition on key routes. They receive favorable airport gate allocations, slot priority at congested hubs, and in moments of crisis, direct bailouts. During the early 2020s, governments around the world handed airlines tens of billions of dollars in grants, loans, and payroll support, often with very few strings attached. From the perspective of a passenger, the airline appears to be a private business competing in a free market. From inside, it is something more interesting. It is a private business with a public safety net stitched into nearly every layer of its operations. If you have flown in the last 15 years, you have noticed something. The base fare keeps shrinking, but the final price keeps rising. The seat itself is cheap. Everything around the seat is not. Choosing your seat costs extra. Checking a bag costs extra. Carrying a slightly larger bag costs extra. Boarding earlier costs extra. Changing your flight costs extra. Canceling costs extra. Eating costs extra. Wi-Fi costs extra. Sometimes printing your boarding pass at the airport costs extra. This is not random. This is a deliberate financial architecture, and it has a name inside the industry. It is called ancillary revenue, and for many carriers, it now represents a fundamental part of total income. For some low-cost airlines, ancillary revenue exceeds the revenue from ticket sales themselves. The plane is essentially a vehicle for selling everything around the act of flying. The strategy works because of a quirk of human psychology. Travelers compare the headline fare. They scan booking sites looking for the lowest visible number. The airline that wins that comparison gets the click, and once you have clicked, you are inside their ecosystem. Now they can charge for the seat selection, for the bag, for the meal, for the priority boarding. Each individual fee is small enough to feel acceptable. Together, they often double the original ticket price. From the airline's point of view, this approach has a beautiful property. A seat sold at $30 and another seat sold at $300 carry the same operational cost. But the bag, The meal, the priority lane all generate marginal revenue with almost no marginal cost. The seat is a loss leader, the fees are the prize. Ancillary revenue is also largely insulated from the price wars that destroyed the legacy carriers. Two airlines might compete fiercely onto the headline fare from London to Madrid, but neither is going to compete by lowering the bag fee because passengers do not comparison shop on bag fees. They notice them only at the moment of payment. When it is already too late to switch, the flight is no longer a transaction. It is a funnel. Walk through a modern airport and look at the aircraft on the tarmac. The airline's name is painted on the side. The crew wear that airline's uniform. Everything visible signals ownership. In reality, many of those aircraft do not belong to the airline at all. They belong to leasing companies, financial institutions, sovereign wealth funds, and specialized aircraft investment firms. The airline pays a monthly lease fee the way you might lease a car, and books the aircraft as an operating expense rather than a capital purchase. This is not a small phenomenon. A significant share of the global commercial fleet is leased rather than owned. For the airline, leasing solves an enormous problem. Aircraft are extraordinarily expensive. A single wide-body jet can cost $300 million or more. Buying a fleet outright would lock up capital that could be deployed elsewhere. Leasing turns that mountain of cost into a manageable monthly payment, and it gives the carrier the flexibility to return aircraft when demand softens or upgrade to newer models when fuel efficiency improves. From the financial side, this arrangement created an entirely new asset class. Aircraft are durable. They have predictable lifespans. They generate steady cash flow through lease payments, pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth vehicles. All of them have poured capital into aviation leasing, treating airplanes the way they treat office buildings, as long-term yield-generating assets. Layer on top of this the world of fuel hedging. Jet fuel can swing wildly in price, and a sudden spike can wipe out a quarter of profits. So airlines enter into financial contracts that lock in fuel prices months or years in advance. When done well, these hedges generate paper profits that have nothing to do with how many passengers boarded any particular flight. There are also currency hedges, since major airlines earn revenue in dozens of currencies but pay many of their costs in dollars. Underneath the friendly cabin announcements and the snack cart, a major airline is running a financial trading desk that would not look out of place at a mid-size hedge fund. On any given day, the carrier might lose money on the flying and gain money on the trading. Here is something most travelers will never think about. At the busiest airports in the world, the right to land an aircraft at a specific time is itself a valuable asset. These rights are called slots, and at major hubs like London Heathrow, New York Kennedy, Tokyo Haneda, or Frankfurt, slots are tightly limited. There are only so many landings and takeoffs the airport can physically handle in an hour. Possession of those slots is a form of property. Slots can be traded between airlines. They can be leased. They can be used as collateral for loans. A pair of slots at a congested major hub has been valued in the tens of millions of dollars, sometimes more. When an airline goes bankrupt, the slots themselves are often the most valuable thing in the wreckage. Competitors line up to buy them at auction. This means that an airline owns, in effect, a portfolio of invisible real estate scattered across the world's most important airports. That portfolio appears on the balance sheet, can be borrowed against, and gives the airline a structural advantage that no new entrant can easily replicate. A startup carrier could buy aircraft tomorrow, hire pilots, design a logo. It still could not get a slot at peak hours into one of the major hubs, because those slots are already spoken for, and the existing holders have no reason to give them up. There is a similar logic with route rights. International aviation is governed by a web of bilateral treaties between countries. Two governments negotiate how many flights each country's airlines can operate between their territories, which cities they can serve, sometimes even what fares they can charge. Once an airline secures the rights to a lucrative international route, those rights act almost like a license to print money, protected from competition by treaty. Combine slots, route rights, gate leases, and long-term airport contracts, and you arrive at a powerful idea. A major airline is not just an operator of flying machines. It is a real estate company in the sky. An empty plane sitting at a Heathrow gate is still occupying one of the most valuable slots in the world. That slot has value whether the plane is full or empty. Here is where the picture becomes almost counterintuitive. There are situations in which an airline will deliberately fly an empty or near-empty aircraft, fully aware that the flight itself will lose money because the alternative is worse. One reason is the slot rule. At many major airports, an airline must use a slot a minimum percentage of the time or lose it permanently. If the airline lets a slot go dormant, a competitor can claim it. So when demand collapses on a particular route, the carrier may choose to operate the flight anyway, sometimes with almost no passengers, simply to preserve the slot. The lost revenue on that flight is the cost of protecting an asset worth millions. A second reason is network integrity. Airlines do not operate routes in isolation, they operate networks. A flight from a small regional city into a major hub may lose money on its own, but it feeds passengers into long-haul international flights that are highly profitable. Cancel the regional feeder, and the international flight starts to empty out. So the airline runs the feeder at a loss because the network depends on it. A third reason is contractual obligation. Certain routes are subsidized by governments. Others are tied to alliance agreements with partner airlines. Canceling those flights can trigger penalties, damage relationships, or jeopardize broader business arrangements. It is cheaper to fly half-empty than to break the contract. A fourth reason is repositioning. Aircraft sometimes need to be moved from one airport to another to be in the right place for the next scheduled flight. These are called ferry flights. They carry no passengers. They generate no ticket revenue. But without them, the entire schedule would collapse. Then there is the strategic empty flight, the one designed to send a market signal. By maintaining presence on a route, an airline tells competitors that this is its territory. Abandon the route, and a rival might rush in to fill the void. Better to fly empty for a quarter than to cede the corridor entirely. To an outside observer, that nearly empty plane looks like failure. From inside the airline, it looks like rational defense. Sometimes losing a small amount of money on a flight is the smartest financial decision the airline will make all year. Step back now and look at the whole machine. On one side, you have the romantic image of aviation, the aircraft, the runway, the destination, the journey. On the other side, you have the actual financial structure of the modern airline, a vast multi-layered system that earns money from cargo, from points, from credit cards, from subsidies, from fees, from leases, from hedges, from slots, from route rights, and from the careful management of contracts that most passengers will never read. Within that structure, the seat you sit in is a single moving part. Important, yes, but only one piece of an engine that has many other pieces. Strip out the passengers entirely on a single flight, and the airline still earns from the cargo in the belly. Strip out the cargo, and the carrier still earns from the loyalty program selling miles to a bank. Strip out the bank deal, and revenue still flows from the government subsidy on that regional route. Strip out the subsidy, and the slot at the hub airport still appreciates in value, ready to be borrowed against. This is why airlines that look fragile from the outside often survive crises that would destroy almost any other industry. They have built so many overlapping revenue streams, so many financial buffers, so many contractual protections, that the empty seat, once the symbol of failure, has become almost beside the point. The next time you board a flight, take a quiet moment to look around the cabin. Notice the empty seats, if there are any. Notice the cargo handlers loading the belly. Notice the credit card advertisement on the seat back in front of you, offering you miles for signing up. You are inside a machine engineered for 4 decades to extract value from almost every dimension of the act of flight. Your ticket is one input. The empty seats are not a wound. They are just one variable in an equation built to keep producing money under almost any condition. If this story changed the way you see the airline industry, watch the next investigation in this series. We pull apart another global business that hides its real revenue model in the same way, and the parallels will surprise you. The link is on screen now and in the description below. Until next time, this has been Titan Codex. Keep watching the machine behind the curtain.